Hello everyone. Today what I would like to do is to showcase some of the processes and some of the work that has gone into cleaning and preparing this data set for analysis. Yeah. Now we know that the survey had multiple pathways. Question formats were different as well as language depending upon whether the birthing person was currently pregnant or is reporting on a past pregnancy, and if the past pregnancy resulted in a loss. And so big part of the data cleaning process or data managing process is to merge the responses in these three pathways to one variable so that we have all the information in one column. Yeah. So that takes a chunk of the time. Now, the other thing that was done for the respect data set in order to increase the response rate as well as the completion rate for these survey questions, there was the initial survey, which we now refer to as the long survey in the lab at the lab, was consisted of over 300 questions. And what we were observing was that even though the participation rates were high, the completion rates were not. In order to improve those completion rates, a shorter survey was created, which was then released. And so the second big task which has been completed now. The first few months were spent using Qualtrics as well as other softwares to merge the two surveys, the long survey and the short survey. We generally refer to that as appending the data set. You are adding the two surveys together. So let's move on to at the variable level, at the question level, what is involved. So in order to calculate the BMI, work with for the height question as well as for the weight question. Yeah? So this is question number 34 in our surveys, and the respondents could either report this in terms of inches or centimeters. So there were two options available. And there are roughly more than 5,000 respondents that answered this question, but not everyone responded with numerical values. Yeah? So if you see on the right hand side, there were people who wrote the whole thing down, 5 feet 6 inches, and some that wrote down 5 only in numerical terms. So there are various ways that they wrote down these answers. And so one task was to go through these responses and then convert them into numbers, both for the respondents that answered in terms of inches and others that answered in terms of centimeters. And again, after having done that, the second task is to now look at all the different pathways and combine all the pathways into one variable. Here we have an overview of how many data points we have. For the initial questions, we have roughly 6,000 observations. For Madam score, autonomy index, there just above 5,000 observations. And as we move through the survey, we lose participants, and roughly 3,600 respondents completed the survey. Now we are here looking at the representation from different provinces, and Ontario has the biggest representation with 33% of the respondents coming in from Ontario, and that's your 2,034 observations, followed by British Columbia and then Quebec. And then we have Alberta with 560 respondents, which is 9% of the total survey population. Now, I'll be presenting some of the cross tabulations with Madam score. So I'll just give you a brief overview of this. There were multiple questions that were used to capture the autonomy of the birthing person, and an index was developed, which was also validated, and this is a score which ranges from 7 to 42, and higher the score implies a higher autonomy as perceived by the pregnant person. So the Madam index, mother's autonomy in decision making, is a good measure of the level of autonomy that is perceived, or the level of agency as perceived by the pregnant person. Now these are the Madam scores across provinces. Yeah. The province with the highest Madam score is British Columbia with 4.48, followed very closely by Ontario, 4.38. Yeah. Now, then we have quite a few others with low Madam scores, like New Brunswick. But overall, the lowest and the highest, there isn't seem to be now this is the Madam score across provinces. The province with the highest Madam score is British Columbia with 4.48, and then we have Ontario with 4.38, and so these are provinces with the highest Madam score. Keep in mind that this is an index and not the exact measure of Madam score. Place of birth. This is a distribution of respondents across birthing place. The highest proportion is for planned hospital births and birth center hospitals, followed by planned home birth, 328 observations. And we have 141 for freestanding birth centers, and so on. Now this is the Madam score across place of birth, freestanding birth centers and planned home births with the highest Madam score, and then it declines for planned hospitals and birth centers in hospitals. And this is the distribution of Madam score across the birthplace. And the reason for this slide is to just highlight or point out the tail end outliers for planned home birth and freestanding birth centers and transfer from home and birthing centers. Yes, there are very low scores as outliers for these three place of birth. Care provider, this is only for prenatal. This is the distribution, and as you can see, we are now down to 5,540 observation or data points. Yeah, so a bigger chunk is doctor and OBGY, and then we have midwives. This roughly 35% prenatal care providers that are midwives. Very few nurse practitioners. Now this is the prenatal care providers and the number of prenatal visits that respondents have had. 4 visits or fewer, or more than 4 visits. Now more than 4 visits for almost all care providers, it's pretty high number, above 96, but the highest is for the midwives and the lowest is for nurse practitioners. But at the same time, we have very few data points for nurse practitioners, and so the more reliable ones are looking at doctor and OBGYNs. Now these are the Madam scores across prenatal care providers, and the difference is quite astounding here. Now, Madam score is the highest for midwives and lowest for nurse practitioners and OBGYN. But again, for nurse practitioners, we have very few data points, and so these ones are more trustable, and so that's a quite a big difference. And yes, and this is one, these are significant as well. Now the other index is the Mori index, and this is capturing the respect aspect of maternity care. and we find a similar pattern for Mori score as well, highest for midwives and the lowest for nurse practitioners, yeah, and OBGYNs, and then doctors are slightly above OBGYNs. I'll just show you the madam scores again. Yeah. So the difference is less in case of Mori score, but the pattern is the same. And these are the number of observations we have for pregnancy loss. Roughly 349 observations, and the timing of the loss. So most of these are in the first trimester. There are more than 100 data points where the respondent had a loss in the second trimester or later. Just to give you numbers, it's 125 for the later birth loss.